The wind whispered through the dusty streets of Carmel by the sea, carrying with it the scent of salt and old memories. The sun, now slipping beneath the horizon, painted the ocean with streaks of gold and amber. On a worn wooden bench, Clint Eastwood sat with his hat tilted just enough to shadow his eyes. He watched the town move around him, a silent observer of a place that had become home, yet never quite lost its sense of transience. For all his years and all his successes, some memories never faded. The scrape of hunger against his ribs as a boy, the sound of his father's tired sighs after long days of searching for work, the relentless churn of survival in the Great Depression. They were ghosts that never truly left, not even after decades of fame. Hardship had carved his resilience, and resilience had shaped his life. It was an old truth. Hope didn't belong to the strongest, but to those who refused to let go. A few streets away, in a small weathered house, a little girl named Susan curled up beneath a tattered blanket. The air inside was thin and tired, filled with quiet desperation. Her parents, James and Taylor, sat nearby, their hands clasped together, searching for strength where there was none left to find. "It's going to be okay, Mom," Susan whispered, her voice feeble but sure. Taylor forced a smile, brushing her daughter's forehead. "Of course, sweetheart. Just rest." But night brought no rest, only worry. The medicine they needed was too expensive, and the town that had once been a community now felt like strangers surviving side by side. Everyone was too busy fighting their own battles to notice the silent struggles of others. Clint walked through the neighborhood that evening, hands buried in the pockets of his coat. It was a habit of his, wandering without destination, watching the world unfold in its quiet ways. That was when he saw her. Through the dim light of an old street lamp, he caught a glimpse of Susan, her small frame barely visible behind the frayed curtains of the window. Her face was pale, her eyes holding a strength that far exceeded her years. A knot tightened in his stomach. He knew that look. He had worn it once, long ago. It was strange how a single moment could shift something inside you. Clint didn't believe in fate, not really. But he did believe in choices. And this felt like one of those moments where you either walk away and forget, or you step forward and do something that matters. The next evening, as the sky faded into dusk, Clint found himself near that same house again. This time, Susan was outside, sitting on the front step, a chipped teacup cradled in her hands. "You like sunsets?" he asked, his voice steady but gentle. She looked up at him, eyes curious but not afraid. "Yeah," she said after a moment. "They mean tomorrow might be better." Something in his chest tightened. Such a simple answer, but full of something most people had lost along the way. He sat beside her, letting the silence stretch between them. "I'm Susan," she finally said. "Who are you?" Clint gave the faintest smile. "Just an old traveler." Susan giggled. "Are you staying?" "For a while." The town carried on, oblivious, as a quiet friendship began to take root. Susan told stories, wild, wonderful tales about places she had never been and dreams she had yet to chase. Clint listened, never interrupting, letting her words weave pictures in the air. And without her realizing it, he had already made a decision. Later that night, an envelope slipped beneath the door of her house. Inside, a modest sum of money, enough to help, but not so much as to draw suspicion. The next morning, the town baker left a fresh loaf of bread on their doorstep without a word. Small, unnoticed gestures, but ones that carried weight. Hope, Clint had learned, didn't need grand acts. Sometimes, it just needed a quiet push in the right direction. Engagement moment. Have you ever had a stranger's kindness change your day? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes, the smallest acts leave the biggest marks. Susan's cough broke the stillness of the night. Taylor sat beside her, running gentle fingers through her daughter's hair, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. The fever had been coming and going for days now, each wave leaving Susan weaker. The money Clint had left helped, but it wasn't enough. Medicine was expensive, and time was slipping away too fast. Meanwhile, Clint had made his own silent decisions. He spoke to the town's baker, the grocer, even the local pharmacist. No questions were asked, only quiet nods exchanged. A small bag of apples found its way into the family's groceries. A bottle of cough syrup appeared on their doorstep, wrapped in brown paper. Kindness spread, unnoticed by most, but felt where it mattered. One afternoon, Clint found Susan sitting on the same front step, bundled in a coat too big for her small frame. A light breeze rustled the dry leaves on the sidewalk, carrying the scent of sea salt and coming rain. "You know," she said, her voice raspier than before, "I figured you out." Clint raised an eyebrow, amused. "That so?" Susan nodded, her eyes twinkling with the kind of certainty only children have. "You're the one leaving all the secret stuff. The food, the money." He leaned back against the wooden railing, taking a long moment before answering. "What makes you think that?" She shrugged. "Nobody else cares enough. And you walk around town like you're looking for something." Clint exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Smart kid." Susan grinned. "I know." The wind picked up, making her shiver. Clint noticed. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small folded paper. "Here," he said, handing it to her. Susan unfolded it carefully. Inside, just a few words written in neat, slanted script. "Hope isn't a wish. It's a choice." She traced the letters with her fingers, then looked up. "Did you make that choice?" "Every day," Clint said simply. She thought about that for a moment, then nodded as if filing it away for later. Engagement moment. Have you ever had a moment where someone's words stayed with you? Words that changed how you saw things? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes, a few simple words can make all the difference. That night, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Susan's cough worsened. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps, and Taylor knew this wasn't just another bad night. This was worse. James ran out into the storm, desperate for help, but the town's hospital was overcrowded, the waiting lists too long. Desperation clung to every word as he called for someone, to tell him what to do. And that was when Clint heard. Without hesitation, he grabbed his keys, his jaw tightening. He had made many choices in his life, but this wasn't a choice at all. The rain lashed against the windshield as he drove through the dark streets, tires kicking up water. By the time he reached the small house, Taylor was already outside, Susan bundled in her arms, her breathing shallow. James stood beside them, drenched, pleading without words. "Get in," Clint said. "No room for argument." Taylor hesitated for only a second before climbing into the car. James followed. Clint hit the gas, the headlights cutting through the storm, as they sped toward the only place that could help, his private contact, a doctor who owed him a favor. In the backseat, Susan's small hand found Taylor's. "Mom," she whispered, eyes half-lidded. "I always knew." Taylor's voice broke. "Knew what, sweetheart?" "That he was the one," Susan murmured. Then, she closed her eyes, trusting that wherever they were going, it would be safe. Clint's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He didn't pray much, never had. But tonight, as the rain hammered down, and the tires skidded on wet pavement, he made a quiet promise to whatever force might be listening. He wouldn't let her slip away. Not tonight. The rain drummed against the car roof, a steady rhythm of urgency as Clint pressed harder on the gas. Every second counted. The wipers struggled to keep up with the storm, streaking water across the windshield in frantic swipes. Taylor held Susan tightly in the backseat, whispering reassurances even as fear cracked through her voice. James gripped his wife's shoulder. "She's gonna be okay," he said, but the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. Clint said nothing, eyes locked on the road ahead. He had always trusted his instincts. They had kept him alive, led him through war, through Hollywood, through decades of choices both good and bad. Tonight, they told him only one thing: keep driving. When they reached the small private clinic, Clint didn't wait. He threw the car into park, swung open the door, and was already moving before the others had even unbuckled their seats. The front entrance light flickered in the downpour, casting long shadows as he pounded on the glass. The door opened a moment later, revealing Dr. Reynolds, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, wearing the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much. His gaze flicked from Clint to the bundled figure in Taylor's arms, and in an instant, he understood. Bring her in. The next hour was a blur of hushed voices, medical equipment, and too many held breaths. Taylor sat beside Susan, holding her small, fever-warm hand. James stood against the wall, shoulders rigid, while Clint remained by the door, arms crossed, unreadable. Dr. Reynolds worked quickly, methodically. IV fluids, oxygen, fever reducers. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had done this 100 times. But tonight, it felt different. Maybe because he knew who had brought the girl here. Maybe because he understood what it meant to Clint. Minutes stretched into eternity until, finally, the doctor exhaled. He turned to Taylor and James. She's stable. Taylor let out a breath that was almost a sob. James covered his face with his hands. Clint just nodded, once. Engagement moment. Ever been in a moment where time felt like it stopped? A moment where every second felt heavier than the last? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes, those moments shape us more than we realize. Hours passed before Susan stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly taking in the room, the faces hovering near her bedside. Her lips parted slightly, voice hoarse but steady. Mom. Taylor choked back tears, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe. Susan blinked, then turned her head ever so slightly, locking eyes with Clint. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. You stayed. Clint, who had faced down directors, critics, and war zones, found himself at a rare loss for words. He simply tipped his hat. Reckon I did. Susan's fingers twitched against the sheets, reaching slightly. Clint hesitated, then stepped closer, his calloused hand closing gently around hers for just a second before letting go. No words needed. She understood. The storm outside had begun to settle, rain softening to a quiet drizzle against the windows. In the stillness of that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a kind of understanding that didn't need explanation. Outside, the world kept turning. But here, in this small clinic, a quiet promise had been made. The first morning light crept through the clinic's windows, casting soft golden streaks over the room. The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and a sky wiped clean, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled. Susan was still weak, but the danger had passed. Her small fingers traced absent patterns against the hospital blanket, her mind awake, alert. Clint sat in a corner, arms crossed, eyes steady as he watched over her. He wasn't the kind of man to hover, but something in him wouldn't let him leave just yet. Susan noticed. She turned her head slightly, studying him with that same quiet understanding she always had. You saved me, she murmured. Clint gave a slow shake of his head. Nah, just made sure you got where you needed to be. Susan's lips curved into a small, tired smile. Same thing. Taylor, sitting beside her daughter, reached for Susan's hand, brushing her thumb over her knuckles. We don't know how to thank you, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. James nodded beside her, his eyes still carrying the weight of a sleepless night. Clint leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. Ain't about thanks, he said simply. It's about doing what's right. The town didn't know yet, not fully, but they would. Word would spread, in the way it always did in places like this. They'd hear about how a little girl had been given another chance, how a stranger had stepped in when no one else did. And maybe, just maybe, it would make them look a little closer at the people around them. Maybe they'd remember that community wasn't just about living side by side, but about carrying each other when the weight got too heavy. Later that day, when Susan was strong enough to sit up, she picked at the edge of her blanket thoughtfully. "You know what I think?" she asked, tilting her head at Clint. He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I think people forget how easy it is to be kind." Clint studied her for a long moment, then gave a small, approving nod. "Reckon you're right." Engagement moment. Do you think kindness is something people forget too easily? Have you ever seen a small act of kindness change someone's life? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes it's the quietest gestures that echo the loudest. By evening, the clinic's doors opened, and Susan took her first steps outside, wrapped in a borrowed coat, her parents flanking her protectively. The townspeople had gathered, not by request, not by obligation, but because something in them had shifted. A quiet realization, a need to be better than they had been. The baker, who had started leaving fresh loaves on their doorstep, handed Taylor a warm roll without a word. The grocer, who had slipped apples into their bag, gave James a nod. Small things, but things that mattered. And then there was Clint, standing a little apart, as he always did, ready to slip away, unseen, because that was how he preferred things. But Susan wouldn't let him. She stepped forward, her feet unsteady but her resolve firm, and reached out, pressing something into his hand. A folded piece of paper. Clint opened it carefully. Inside, in the same neat scrawl as before, were just a few words. "Hope isn't a wish. It's a choice." Susan smiled up at him. "You told me that once." Clint folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "Guess I did." He tipped his hat, just slightly, then turned, walking toward his car. No grand speeches, no lingering goodbyes. That wasn't his way. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. As he drove down the quiet streets of Carmel by the Sea, the town left behind him felt different. Not because one man had stepped in, but because one act had reminded them all of something they had forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, they'd carry that forward. Susan watched until his car disappeared over the hill, then looked down at her mother and father, hand in hand. The world felt a little warmer, a little lighter. And she knew, deep down, that kindness wasn't something that faded. It only ever spread. Final engagement moment. Have you ever met someone who changed the way you see the world? Maybe just for a moment. Maybe for a lifetime. Tell me your story in the comments. We never know whose life we might be touching. The road stretched out before him, winding along the coastline, the last traces of the storm swept away by the rising sun. Clint drove in silence, the hum of the engine steady beneath him. The town of Carmel by the Sea grew smaller in his rearview mirror, but something told him it would linger in his thoughts longer than most places ever did. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing against the small folded note Susan had given him. Pulling it out, he read the words again. "Hope isn't a wish. It's a choice." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Smart kid. Back in town, life moved forward, but not in the way it always had. The small, unnoticed gestures that had begun in secret continued, now more openly. The baker made sure no one went without bread. The grocer quietly set aside extra for those in need. Neighbors, once strangers, began to check in on each other. And Susan, well, Susan carried something new inside her now. Not just gratitude, but understanding. That even the smallest hand can tip the balance of the world. She sat on her front steps, her coat wrapped tight around her, staring at the horizon where Clint had disappeared. A part of her knew she might never see him again. But another part of her also knew that wasn't really true. Because the things that matter, the things that change people, never really leave. They stay, in words, in actions, in choices. And Susan had already made hers. One evening, as the sky turned that soft shade of orange she loved so much, she picked up a worn-out notebook and began to write. Not about what had happened, but about what could happen. About kindness. About hope. About a world where people chose to see each other, to help without expecting anything in return. Because hope wasn't a wish. It was a choice. And she was choosing it every single day. If you love powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.